My mother called me the failure for 18 years, and on the morning of my brother's wedding, she leaned in close, adjusted my dress like she actually cared for once, and whispered, "Don't embarrass us," like that was something I had. I spent my entire life trying not to do, and I just smiled, nodded, and said, "Nothing." Because I had learned a long time ago that defending myself never changed anything. It just gave her more reasons to prove her point. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that 2 hours later the music would stop, every conversation would freeze, and she would be the one standing there, wishing she had never said a word to me at all. So, before I tell you what happened in the moment, I need to ask you something. Have you ever been labeled something so many times that people stopped seeing who you actually were? If you have, type enough in the comments, and stay with me, because this didn't start at the wedding. It started a long time before that, back when I was still trying to be someone my mother could be proud of. My name is Hannah Brooks. I'm 27 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I wasn't Hannah in my house. I was the disappointment, the mistake, the one who never quite made it, and the worst part wasn't that she said those things. It was how normal it felt, how those words became part of the background of my life, like something I was supposed to grow into instead of grow out of. My older brother Daniel was the opposite of everything I was labeled as, or at least that's how she saw it. He was the one she introduced with pride, the one she talked about at every family gathering, the one who could do no wrong even when he did, and I was the contrast, the example she used to show what not to be. And at first, when we were younger, I didn't understand it. I thought maybe if I worked harder, if I did better in school, if I stayed out of trouble, things would balance out eventually, that she would see me differently, that I would earn my way into being enough. But that never happened. No matter what I did, the label stayed the same, like it had already been decided before I even had the time, a chance to prove otherwise. I remember one moment more clearly than the others. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the first time I realized this wasn't something I could fix. I was 13, standing in the kitchen holding a report card that I had worked harder for than anything else at that point. Straight A's. Something I thought would finally change the way she looked at me, and when I handed it to her, she barely glanced at it before setting it down on the counter and saying, He doesn't mean anything if you don't have direction." And then, without even looking at me again, she added, "Your brother never needed to try this hard, and that was it. No acknowledgement, no recognition. Just another way to remind me that whatever I did would always be measured against someone else's version of success. And that moment stayed with me not because it hurt more than the others, but because it shifted something in how I saw everything after that. I stopped expecting her to. Change stopped believing that there was some version of me that would finally be enough for her. And instead, I started focusing on something else, something quieter, something she didn't pay attention to. Building a life outside of her expectations, piece by piece, without announcing it, without asking for approval. Just doing the work and letting the results exist on their own. And over time, that became my normal. Not reacting, not defending, just moving forward in the way that didn't depend on her seeing it. And by the time my brother's wedding came around, I had already built something she knew nothing about. Something that didn't fit into the version of me she had held onto for 18 years. And standing there that morning, listening to her remind me one more time not to embarrass them, I realized something clearly. I didn't need to prove her wrong anymore. I just needed to let the truth show up on its own. And 2 hours later, that's exactly what happened. Growing up in our house, the roles were never officially assigned. No one sat us down and explained them, but somehow everyone understood exactly where they stood. My brother Daniel was the one everything revolved around, the one my mother built her expectations on, the one she introduced to people with. A kind of pride that made it clear he represented something bigger than just himself, and I was everything else. The comparison, the warning, the quiet example of what didn't meet the standard she had in her mind, and it showed up in ways that were small enough to ignore if you wanted to, but consistent enough that you couldn't escape them. Birthdays, for example, were never equal. Daniel's were planned weeks in advance, themed, coordinated, filled with people and attention, while mine were quieter, simpler, something that felt more like an obligation than a celebration, and I told myself that didn't matter, that it was just a difference in personality, that maybe I didn't need all of that, but deep down I knew it wasn't about preference, it was about priority. The school was the same when Daniel brought home grades. They were expected, praised, turned into conversations about his future, his potential, what he was. I'm going to become, but when I did, well, it was either dismissed or questioned, like it wasn't sustainable, like it didn't align with the version of me she had already decided on. And when I didn't do perfectly, when I made normal mistakes, it became proof, confirmation that she had been right about me all along. This is why you fall behind, she would say, not angry, not emotional, just certain, like she was stating the fact that didn't need to be argued. And over time, those patterns stopped surprising me. They became predictable, almost structured, like a system that operated the same way no matter what input I gave it. And the hardest part wasn't the unfairness itself, it was how invisible it was to everyone else. Relatives would come over and see a normal family, a supportive mother, a successful son, a quiet daughter, and nothing about that image suggested what was actually happening underneath. Because my mother was careful. She didn't yell in front of people. She didn't create scenes. She shaped the narrative in subtle ways. Small comments, backhanded compliments, the kind that sound harmless. If you don't know the context, Hannah tries her best, she would say with a smile, and people would nod. Like that was encouragement, not realizing it was a reminder that trying was the most I could offer that. Excellence wasn't expected from me the way it was from Daniel, and for a long time I played into that without realizing it. I stayed quiet, avoided conflict, did what I could within the space I was given, because pushing back only made things worse. It didn't change her mind. It just reinforced her view that I was difficult, too emotional, not as composed as my brother, and that comparison followed me into everything, choices, opportunities, even the way I saw myself, because when you hear something enough times, especially from someone who is supposed to know you best, it starts to shape how you think, not all at once, but gradually, until it feels like truth instead of opinion. And I carried that for years, not openly, not in a way that stopped me from functioning, but in the background of every decision, every risk, every moment, where I had to choose whether I believed in myself or the version of me she had repeated so often. And Daniel, for his part, he wasn't cruel. He didn't go out of his way to put me down, but it didn't question the system either, because it worked in his favor, and when something benefits you long enough, it starts to feel normal, like the way things are supposed to be. So he accepted the attention, the support, the opportunities, without asking what it meant for me. And I don't blame him for that, not anymore, because understanding the system doesn't always mean you know how to step outside of it, but back then it still left me in the same position on the outside of something I had never been given a fair chance to be part of. And as we got older, those differences didn't fade. They became more defined, more tied to real outcomes, college choices, career paths, expectations that came with actual consequences. And my mother's narrative didn't change with time. It became more solid, more confident, like years of repetition had turned it into something she believed completely, not just about me, but about how the world worked, who was worth investing in, and who wasn't. And by the time we reached adulthood, by the time my brother was building a life that fit perfectly into everything she had imagined for him, I had already stopped trying to fit into that same picture, not because I gave up, but because I realized that no matter what I did, that picture didn't have space for me in it, and instead of forcing myself into something that would never accept me, I started building something else, something separate, something she didn't see because she wasn't looking for it. And that decision, quiet as it was at the time, was the one that would eventually change everything. Not in a way she could control, not in a way she could predict, but in a way that would make her question everything she thought she knew about me the moment the music stopped at that wedding. The moment I truly understood that nothing I did would ever change how my mother saw me. I didn't come from a big argument or a dramatic confrontation. It came from something much quieter, something that felt almost ordinary at the time, but stayed with me longer than anything else. It was the night Daniel got engaged. The house was full. Relatives, friends, laughter, everything centered around him the way it always had been. My mother moving through the room with that same proud energy, introducing his fiancée, telling their story like it was something she had personally built from the ground up. And I stood there watching it all unfold, not bitter, not even surprised, just aware of how consistent everything was, how nothing had really changed even as our lives moved forward at one point. Someone asked about me. A simple question, casual, the kind people ask without thinking too much about it. And what about Hannah? And for a second, just a second, I thought maybe this time would be different, that after all these years, after everything I had quietly built on my own, there would be something else in her answer, something that reflected who I actually was. But instead she smiled politely and said Hannah is still figuring things out, and the way he said it calm, almost dismissive, landed harder than anything she had said directly to me, because it wasn't just her opinion anymore. It was the version of me she had chosen to present to the world, and everyone around us accepted it without question, nodding, moving on as if that one sentence explained everything there was to know about me. And I remember standing there, holding a glass I hadn't even realized I had picked up, feeling something shift in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. The kind that doesn't come from emotion, but from understanding something completely for the first time. I wasn't just misunderstood in her eyes. I was fixed, defined in a way that no new information could change, because it wasn't based on who I was. It was based on who she needed me to be in the story. She had created Daniel, the success, Hannah, the failure. And that contrast was what made everything make sense to her, what gave structure to how she viewed the world. And the realization hit me, all at once, that I had been trying to solve the wrong problem that my entire life. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, I could change her perception of me. But her perception wasn't built on evidence. It was built on identity. And identities don't change just because facts. Do they change? When people are willing to see something differently, and she wasn't. Not then, not ever. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a room full of people who only knew me through her version, I made a decision that didn't feel dramatic but was more final than anything I had done before. I stopped trying to be seen by her, not out of frustration, not as a reaction, but as a shift in focus, because I understood that continuing to seek validation from someone who had already decided who I was would only keep me in the same place, repeating the same cycle, hoping for a different result that was never going to come. And instead, I redirected that energy into something else, something that didn't depend on her recognition. I started building quietly, not in a way that drew attention, not in the way that invited commentary, but in a way that created results. Over a time I took risks. She would have called irresponsible, made decisions. She would have questioned, stepped into spaces she didn't believe I belonged in, and I did it without telling her, without needing her to understand it, because for the first time, I wasn't measuring my progress by whether she approved of it. I was measuring it by whether it worked, whether it moved me forward, whether it created something real that I could stand on regardless of how she chose to see me. And that shift changed everything. Not immediately, not in a way that was visible from the outside, but internally it gave me something I had never had before: independence from her narrative. And over time, that independence turned into results, opportunities, stability, things she never saw, because she never looked beyond the version of me she had already decided on. And by the time my brother's wedding came around, that gap between who she thought I was and who I had become had grown so wide that it couldn't stay hidden forever, even if I had wanted it to. And standing there that day, hearing her remind me not to embarrass them, I realized she still believed the same story she had been telling for 18 years, and for the first time I wasn't tempted to correct her. I didn't feel the need to defend myself or explain anything, because I knew something she didn't, that the truth didn't need to be argued anymore. It just needed the right moment to be seen, and that moment was already getting closer with every minute that passed. After that night, something in me didn't break. It settled, like a decision had finally been made without needing to be announced. I went home, walked past my mother, still replaying the engagement party in her head, talking about how perfect everything had been, how proud she was of Daniel, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to listen closely or react at all. Her words became background noise, something that existed but no longer required my attention, and that was new, because before that moment, no matter how much I told myself I didn't care, some part of me was always listening, always measuring, always hoping for something different. But that night removed that completely, not in a dramatic way, not with anger or confrontation, just quietly, like turning off a switch. I didn't even realize I had control over. And the next morning, nothing in the house had changed, but I had. I woke up earlier than usual, sat at my desk and started writing out a plan. Not a perfect one. Not something guaranteed. Just a direction that belonged to me. Something that didn't include waiting for approval or recognition from anyone else. I listed out what I had, what I didn't have, what I could build from, where I was starting. And for the first time, I approached my own life like a problem I could solve instead of a situation I had to endure. I looked at my skills, the things I had learned on my own, the small opportunities I had taken without telling anyone, freelance work, side projects, things my mother would have dismissed as unstable or unimportant. And instead of minimizing them the way I used to, I treated them like building blocks, something that could be expanded if I focused on them. Consistently, I started taking on more work, not the kind that I looked impressive on the surface, but the kind that paid, that taught me something, that connected me to people outside of the small world I had grown up in, and I did it quietly. Not because I was hiding it, but because I didn't need to announce it. I didn't need commentary or approval. I just needed progress. And over time, that progress started to compound in ways I hadn't expected. One client led to another. One project opened the door to something slightly bigger, slightly more stable, and I paid attention to that. Not emotionally, but strategically. I tracked what worked, what didn't, where I could improve, and I adjusted without overthinking it, because I understood that this wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about building something that functioned on its own, something that didn't collapse the moment someone else did. Months passed, then a year, and while my family continued living in the same pattern, celebrating Daniel's milestones, reinforcing the same narrative they had always believed in my life, was moving in a completely different direction, one they didn't see, because it didn't fit into their expectations. I moved out quietly, not as a statement, not as a reaction, just as the next logical step in what I was building. I found a small place, nothing impressive, but mine, paid for with money I had earned myself, and that mattered more than anything else, because it represented something real, something I controlled completely. And from there, everything expanded faster, not because I suddenly became successful overnight, but because I had removed the constant friction of trying to exist in a space that didn't support me. Without that, I could focus entirely on what I was creating. I took bigger risks, said yes to opportunities that felt uncertain, but aligned with where I wanted to go, learned things I had never been, taught because no one in my family valued them, and slowly, without any announcement or recognition, I built something stable, something that grew beyond what I had originally planned. And through all of that, I didn't go back. I didn't update my mother, didn't try to show her what I was doing, because I knew it wouldn't change anything, not until she was willing to see it, and she wasn't. So I let that go completely, and by the time my brother's wedding came around, I wasn't the same, the person she had labeled all those years, but in her mind, nothing had changed. I was still the failure, still the one she needed to manage to correct, to keep in line with the image she cared about more than anything else. And standing there that morning, listening to her whisper, "Don't embarrass us," I realized she had no idea how far removed that version of me was from reality. I still believed she understood exactly who I was, exactly what I was capable of. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to correct her because I knew something she didn't, that the life I had built didn't need her recognition to exist. It just needed the right moment to be seen. And as I looked around that wedding at the venue, the guests, the carefully constructed image my family was presenting to the world, I understood something even more clearly. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a stage, and 2 hours from that moment, everything she thought she knew about me was going to collide with the reality she had never bothered to see. By the time I fully stepped into building my own life, it didn't feel like a bold move or some dramatic turning point. It felt necessary, like something that should have happened long before I even realized it was an option. I stopped looking at my situation as something unfair and started treating it as something I had to work around, because the truth was, waiting for things to become fair would have kept me exactly where I was, and I had already spent too many years in that place. So I focused on what I could control: my time, my skills, my decisions. And I used all of it as efficiently as I could. I took on work that most people around me wouldn't have considered long hours. Unpredictable projects. Things that didn't come with guarantees, but came with opportunities to learn, and that was what I needed more than anything at that stage. Not comfort, not validation, just progress. I started noticing patterns in what I was doing. Certain types of work that brought better results. Certain clients that opened doors to other opportunities. And instead of drifting between options, I leaned into those patterns, refining what I could offer, improving how I presented it, learning not just how to do the work, but how to position it in a way that made people take it seriously. And over time, that shift started to show results, not in a way that anyone in my family would have noticed, but in ways that mattered to me. Consistent income, growing connections, projects that became more structured and more valuable. And with each step forward, the gap between who my mother thought I was and who I actually was became wider, even though she had no idea it was happening. I kept everything separate from my family, not as a secret, but as a boundary, because I understood that bringing it into that space too early would only invite the same dismissal I had dealt with my entire life. And I didn't need that anymore. I needed space to build without interference, without someone constantly questioning whether it was worth it. And that space allowed me to move faster, to take risks I wouldn't have taken before, to say yes to opportunities that I didn't look safe, but aligned with where I wanted to go. And one of those opportunities changed everything in a way I didn't expect. It started as a small project, something that didn't seem significant at first. A contract that came through a referral, a chance to work with a company that was growing but not yet established. And I approached it the same way I approached everything else. Focused, consistent, not over-promising, just delivering what I said I would, and that turned into something bigger. They trusted me with more responsibility, more visibility, more involvement in decisions that actually mattered. And for the first time, I wasn't just executing tasks. I was helping shape outcomes. I was part of something that was growing, and that growth reflected back on me, not in a way that needed to be announced, but in a way that became undeniable. Over time, my role expanded, my income increased, my influence in that space became something people recognized without me having to explain it. And that was when I realized I had crossed the line I didn't even see before. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I wasn't just proving to myself that I could make it work. I had built something real, something stable, something that had value regardless of what anyone else thought about it. And the most important part was, it didn't depend on my family at all. It existed completely outside of that world, and because of that, it grew without being limited by the expectations that had held me back for so long. I moved into a better place. Upgraded slowly, not to impress anyone, but because it made sense for the life I was building. I invested back into my work, into learning, into expanding what I could do. And each decision reinforced the same thing, that I was no longer the person my mother had defined me as, even if she still believed that version of me existed. And through all of this, I never felt the need to go back and show her, not once, because I understood something clearly now, that proving her wrong wouldn't change anything. It would only pull me back into a dynamic I had already moved beyond, so I let her keep her version of me. I let my family continue believing whatever made sense to them, because it no longer had any impact on what I was building. And that distance, that separation between their perception and my reality, became the foundation for everything that came next. Because by the time I received the invitation to the brother's wedding, formal, polished, sent like I was just another guest, instead of someone who had grown up in that house, I had already built a life they knew nothing about. A life that didn't fit into their narrative at all. And as I held that invitation in my hands, reading through the details of an event designed to showcase everything my family valued in most status image presentation, I realized something that made me pause for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I could see exactly what was coming. They were inviting the version of me they still believed in, the failure they thought they understood. But the person who was actually going to show up that day was someone completely different, someone they had never taken the time to see. And for the first time, I understood that I didn't need to correct them beforehand. I didn't. I need to prepare them for that difference. Because the truth, when it finally appeared in a space they couldn't control, would be more than enough on its own. By the time the wedding date got closer, my life had already moved so far beyond anything my family thought they knew about me, that it almost felt like I was stepping into someone else's story when I RSVP'd. Yes, not because I wanted to go back, not because I needed closure, but because I understood something important. This wasn't just a family event. It was a moment where two completely different realities were about to exist in the same space. Theirs built on years of assumptions, and mine built quietly without their involvement. And I wanted to see what would happen when those two things finally collided. The week before the wedding, I received a call that made that collision even more inevitable. It was from the company I had. He'd been working with, not the same casual tone as before, something more formal, more structured. They were finalizing a major expansion, a partnership that would push everything we had been building to a completely different level, and my role in it wasn't small anymore. I wasn't just part of the process, I was central to it. My name was attached to decisions, contracts, outcomes that actually mattered, and for the first time it wasn't something that could stay completely behind the scenes. There were documents, agreements, public-facing elements that connected directly to me, and one of those elements caught my attention immediately: the event sponsorship list for the quarter, the same quarter as my brother's wedding, and I paused when I saw the name of the venue, because it was the same one, the exact same place my family had chosen for the wedding. And at first I thought it was a coincidence, just timing overlapping in a way that didn't mean anything. But when I looked closer, when I followed the details through the chain of contracts and approvals, I realized it wasn't a coincidence at all. Our company was one of the primary financial backers of that venue's recent expansion, the upgrades, the image my family was so proud to present for that wedding. The space they had chosen to showcase everything they believed in was partially built on decisions I had been directly involved in. And I sat there for a moment, not reacting, emotionally just processing what that actually meant, because it wasn't something I had planned. It wasn't a setup I had created for the sake of a moment. It was the natural result of the path I had taken, intersecting with theirs in a way neither of us could have predicted. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was going to matter not because I needed them to know, but because the moment they did, it would force a shift in everything they believed about me. Not through explanation, not through argument, but through reality, something they couldn't dismiss or reframe the way they had done for years. I didn't tell anyone, Not my colleagues, not my family, not even myself, in a way that turned it into a plan. I just noted it, understood it, and let it sit there, as part of the larger picture that was already forming. The day of the wedding arrived exactly as expected, structured, polished, every third, detail aligned with the image my mother had spent years perfecting. Guests arriving in coordinated outfits, conversations filled with subtle comparisons and quiet displays of status, everything designed to reinforce the same narrative she had always believed in: success, control, presentation. And I moved through it all calmly, not standing out, not drawing attention, just present in a way that didn't invite questions. And when my mother approached me that morning, adjusting my dress, reminding me not to embarrass them, I saw it clearly for what it was, not a warning but an assumption. She still believed she understood exactly who I was, exactly what I was capable of. And that belief gave her a sense of control she had never questioned. And I didn't correct her. I didn't hint at anything because I didn't need to. The truth didn't require preparation. It just needed the right moment to be seen. The ceremony itself was exactly what everyone expected: beautiful, controlled, every detail executed perfectly. My brother standing at the altar confident, my mother watching with the kind of pride that filled the entire room, and I sat there quietly observing. Not disconnected, but not emotionally tied to the outcome either, because I understood that this moment, as important as it was to them, was just one part of something much bigger that was already in motion. The reception that followed was where everything started to shift. Not immediately, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in small details, subtle changes in how things were being managed, how the staff interacted, how certain conversations happened behind the scenes. Things I recognized because I knew how these events were structured from the inside, from the side they had never seen. And I could tell something was coming. Not chaotic, not disruptive, but significant enough to interrupt the flow they had so carefully planned. And as the evening moved forward, as the music played, as people relaxed into the celebration, I stayed exactly where I needed to be, not preparing, not reacting, just waiting, because I understood something they didn't: that everything in that room, the venue, the event, the image they were so focused on maintaining, was connected to a reality they had completely overlooked. And in less than 2 hours, that connection was going to become impossible to ignore. By the time the reception fully settled into its rhythm, everything looked exactly the way my family had always wanted it to look: polished, controlled, effortless on the surface, guests laughing, glasses raised, conversations flowing easily, between people who all seemed to belong in the same version of a success my mother had spent years trying to maintain. And I moved through it quietly, not hiding, not standing out, just existing in a way that didn't invite attention, because attention wasn't something I needed anymore. Not from them, not from anyone in that room. And that gave me a kind of freedom I hadn't felt before in spaces like this. I wasn't measuring myself against anyone, wasn't wondering how I was being perceived. I was simply observing, and the more I observed, the more I could see the structure underneath everything. The timing of the speeches, the coordination between staff, the subtle signals that kept the entire event running smoothly. Things most people wouldn't notice unless they had been on the other side of it. And I had, which made it impossible not to recognize when something shifted. It started small, almost invisible: a slight delay in one of the scheduled announcements, a quiet conversation between 2 members of the event, staff near the stage. Nothing that disrupted the atmosphere, just enough to signal that something wasn't following the original plan exactly. And I noticed it immediately, not because I was looking for it, but because I understood how precise these events were supposed to be, how little room there usually was for deviation. My mother didn't notice; she was too focused on the guests, on maintaining the image, moving from table to table, making sure everything looked the way she wanted it to, reinforcing the same narrative she had always believed in, that everything was exactly as it should be, and my brother was the center of it all, surrounded by people congratulating him, celebrating him exactly the way it had always been. And for a moment, I wondered what it must feel like to live in that kind of consistency, to have the world reflect back what you had always been told about yourself, to never have to question whether you belonged in the life you were given. But that thought didn't stay long because it didn't apply to me anymore. I had already built something separate from that, something that didn't rely on being seen or approved in that space. And that separation made what was about to happen feel less like a disruption and more like a reveal. Not something I was causing, but something that was already in motion. The music shifted again, signaling the transition into the next part of the evening speeches, acknowledgments, the part of the night where everything slows down, just enough for attention to focus, and I could feel it building, not in the room, but in the structure behind it, the coordination, tightening, the staff moving with more intention. And then I saw something that confirmed what I had already sensed. The event coordinator speaking with someone I recognized, not from my family, not from the guest list, but from my own work. Someone connected to the company I had been building with, standing just off to the side of the stage, reviewing something on a tablet, and for a second, the two worlds overlapped in a way that made everything perfectly clear. This wasn't random. It wasn't a small delay or a minor adjustment. It was something planned, something intentional, that was about to intersect directly with event my family believed they fully controlled, and I stayed exactly where I was, not moving closer, not reacting because I didn't need to. I already understood what was happening, not every detail, but enough to know that the moment my mother had tried so hard to perfect was about to include something she had never accounted for, something she couldn't manage or reframe the way she always had. And as the speeches began one after another, predictable, emotional, in the way these things are supposed to be, I could feel the timing narrowing, the gap between what was expected and what was actually coming, getting smaller with every minute my mother took her turn, speaking about family, about pride, about how everything had led to this perfect moment. And I listened without reacting, not because her words didn't matter, but because I knew they were about to be placed in a context she had never considered, one where the version of me she had described for 18 years wouldn't be able to exist anymore. And when she finished, when the applause settled and the music started to rise again, something changed, not gradually, not subtly this time, but completely. The music didn't continue. It cut clean, immediate, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a room like that. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People looked toward the stage, confused, waiting for an explanation that didn't come right away, and I didn't move, didn't react, because I had already been there mentally minutes before it happened. And as the room shifted from celebration to uncertainty, I looked toward the stage and saw the moment everything crossed over from what my family believed into what was actually real, and I knew without needing anyone to say it out loud that this was the point where nothing could go back to the fightus way it was before. The silence didn't feel accidental. It felt controlled, like something had been deliberately cut at the exact right moment, and for a few seconds no one moved. Not the guests, not the staff, not even my mother, who was still standing near. The center of the room, with that same composed expression, slowly fading into confusion, because this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't something she could anticipate or manage. And then the lights shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to redirect attention toward the stage, where the event coordinator stepped forward, holding a microphone. Her posture calm, professional, like nothing unusual had happened at all. And that contrast made the moment even sharper. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear, steady, "we'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge a special partnership that made tonight's event possible." And I saw it immediately. The shift in my mother's expression, from confusion to something closer to irritation, because this was her moment, her event, her carefully constructed image, and anything that interrupted it, especially something she didn't control, I felt like a threat to that. She glanced toward the staff, then back to in the stage, trying to understand what was happening without asking directly, because asking would mean admitting she didn't already know, and the coordinator continued without hesitation. "As many of you know, this venue recently underwent a major expansion and renovation. and tonight is one of the first events to take place in this newly upgraded space. A few polite nods from the guests, some light applause, nothing out of the ordinary, yet just information being shared in a way that seemed formal but harmless. And then, she added, this transformation would not have been possible without the support of one of our primary partners, a company that has played a key role in shaping this venue into what it is today. And that was the moment everything narrowed, not in the room but in my understanding of what was about to happen, because I already knew where this was going, even if no one else did. My mother straightened slightly, her attention fully on the stage, now trying to follow something that was slipping just outside of her control, and the coordinator turned, slightly gesturing toward the side of the stage, where a screen came to life behind her, displaying the company name and the logo. I had spent years helping build the one that existed completely outside of my family's world, and for a second, it was just that, a name on a screen, something stare. Most people in the room didn't recognize or connect to anything personal, but my mother did, not because she knew the company, but because she understood what it represented. Influence, investment, status, the same things she valued in every other context. And I watched her expression shift again, curiosity replacing irritation, because now this was something she could engage with, something that fit into her framework of what mattered. And then the coordinator said the next part, and that was where everything changed. Tonight we're honored to have with us one of the key figures behind that partnership, someone whose work has directly contributed to making this venue what it is today. And I felt the room lean in slightly, attention sharpening, curiosity building, in a way that happens naturally when something unexpected becomes important. And I didn't move, not yet, because the moment wasn't about me stepping forward. It was about the realization that was about to happen, before I even said a word. And when the coordinator looked down briefly at her notes, then back up and said my name, clearly, confidently, without hesitation, Hannah Brooks, I saw it happen in real time. The exact second my mother's understanding collapsed under the weight of something she couldn't explain. Her expression froze, not dramatically, not in a way that drew immediate attention, but in a way that was unmistakable. We were looking for it, because the name she had heard didn't match the version of reality she had been operating in for 18 years. And around her, people started to turn, looking for where I was trying to connect the name to a face, to a person, to something they could place within the context of the event. And I stood up slowly, not making a statement, not rushing, just moving with the same calm I had carried through everything that led to this moment. And as I stepped into view, as the distance between who they thought I was and who I was closed in front of them. I didn't look at my mother right away. I looked at the stage, at the space I was walking into, because this wasn't about confronting her. It was about stepping fully into something she had never considered possible. And the silence in the room held just long enough for that realization to spread. Not through words, but through understanding. Because in that moment, no explanation there was needed. The truth was already visible, and there was nothing she could do to reshape it. As I walked toward the stage, the room didn't erupt into noise the way people expect in moments like that. It went quieter, not completely silent, but focused, like every conversation had been paused, mid-thought, and redirected into the same point. Me and I could feel it without needing to look at anyone directly. The shift in attention, the questions forming in people's minds, the attempt to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. And when I stepped up beside the coordinator, she greeted me with the same professional calm, like this was exactly how the evening was supposed to unfold, like there was nothing unusual about any of it. And that contrast made everything sharper. Because for her, for the venue, for the company, this was normal. But for my family, this was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into any version of reality they had prepared for. She handed me the microphone, introduced me briefly again, emphasizing my role, my involvement, the impact of the work I had done, and each word landed in the room with more weight than the last, not because of how it was said, but because of where it was being said in the middle of an event my mother believed she controlled, completely in front of people whose opinions she valued more than anything else. And I didn't rush to speak. I let a second pass, not dramatically, just enough to ground the moment, and when I finally looked out into the crowd, my eyes found them without trying. My mother standing exactly where she had been before, but nothing about her posture was the same. The certainty, the control, all of it had been replaced by something else, something closer to disbelief, like she was still waiting for this to resolve into something she could understand. My brother beside her, his expression caught between confusion and realization, trying to piece together a version of me that matched what he was seeing now. And for a moment, I just held that, not as a confrontation, not as a victory, but as a reality that didn't need to be explained, because the contrast spoke for itself. And then I began to speak, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly thanking the venue, acknowledging the team, keeping everything aligned with the context of the event, because this wasn't about making a scene. It wasn't about turning the moment into something dramatic. It was about letting the truth exist in a space where it couldn't be ignored. And as I spoke, I could feel the room settle into it, the initial shock giving way to attention, to curiosity, to something closer to respect. Because the way I carried myself, the way I spoke didn't match the idea of someone who was out of place. It matched exactly what the moment required, and that was what made it impossible for my mother to dismiss. Because there was no flaw she could point to, no behavior she could label, no way to reshape what was happening into something that fit her narrative. And when I finished, when I handed the microphone back and stepped away from the center of the stage, the applause came naturally, not overwhelming, but steady, genuine, the kind that acknowledges something real. And I didn't linger there, didn't wait for reactions or validation. I simply stepped down and moved back into the space I had come from. But everything had changed, not in the structure of the event. The music resumed. Conversations restarted. The evening continued. But underneath that, there was a shift that couldn't be undone, because now the room knew something my family had never acknowledged, and that knowledge didn't disappear just because the moment had passed. As I moved through the crowd, people approached me differently. Conversations that carried a different tone. Questions asked with a level of respect that came from understanding my position in a way they hadn't before. And I responded the same way I always had, calmly, without exaggeration, without trying to make more of it than it was, because I didn't need to. The moment had already done that on its own, and across the room, I could see my mother still standing there, not frozen anymore, but not moving with the same confidence she had before. Her attention shifting between me and the people around her, trying to gauge what they were thinking, how this had changed the image she had worked so hard to maintain. And for the first time in my life, I saw something in her that I had never seen before. Uncertainty not about me, but about her own. The understanding of the world she had built, because the version of me she had relied on to define that world no longer existed in the way she thought it did. And there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do in that moment to bring it back, and I didn't approach her, didn't move toward that confrontation, because I understood something clearly. This wasn't the moment where I needed to explain anything. This was the moment where she needed to sit with what she had just seen, without interruption, without correction, without the ability to reshape it into something more comfortable. And as the night continued, as the event slowly returned to its rhythm, I stayed exactly where I was, not hiding, not stepping forward, just present, because the truth had already been revealed, and everything that came after this point would no longer be about proving anything. It would be about what they chose to do with a reality they could no longer ignore. I didn't have to go looking for my mother, because moments like that don't stay separate for long. They pull everything toward them, whether you want it or not. And it didn't take more than a few minutes before she started, moving through the crowd in my direction, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of controlled urgency that I recognized immediately, the same way she approached anything that threatened the image she had spent years building. Except this time, there was something different in the way she carried herself. Something less certain, like she wasn't entirely sure what she was walking into. And when she finally stopped in front of me, close enough that no one else could hear us, clearly but still very much in view of everyone around us, she didn't speak right away. She just looked at me, really looked at me in a way she never had before, like she was trying to find the version of me she understood somewhere inside, the person standing in front of her now. And when she finally spoke, her voice was lower than I expected, controlled but strained at the edges. What was that? Hannah. The question wasn't about the event, not really. It was about the gap between what she believed and what she had just seen, and I answered the same way I had handled everything else that night, calmly, directly, without adding anything unnecessary. It was part of my work, I said. And for a second she didn't respond, because that answer didn't give her anything. She could reshape it, didn't fit into a narrative. She could adjust it. It just existed, as it was your work, she repeated. Like the words themselves didn't make sense in relation to me and I. He nodded once, not explaining further, not filling the silence for her, because I understood something clearly now. This wasn't a conversation I needed to lead. It was one she needed to process. And, around us, people were watching, without pretending not to. Conversations nearby had slowed attention, shifting subtly in our direction, not openly staring, but aware enough that anything said or done in that moment would carry beyond just the two of us. And she knew that I could see it in the way her posture adjusted slightly, the way she straightened her shoulders, trying to regain the composure that had always defined how she presented herself. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. And this time, there was something else in her voice. Not anger, not even accusation, just confusion, mixed with something she wasn't used to feeling, a lack of control. And I considered the question for a second before answering, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to be clear. I never asked, I said. And that was enough, because it shifted the responsibility of that silence back to where it had always been. And she didn't argue with it, didn't push back, because there wasn't an easy way to not, without reopening something she wasn't prepared to face in that moment. "People are talking," she said, after a pause, her eyes flicking briefly toward the surrounding guests before returning to me, and I followed her glance for just a second, noticing the way conversations were still orbiting around what had happened, the subtle shift in how people looked at her now compared to earlier that evening. And then I looked back at her, letting the meaning of that statement settle without reacting to it. "They usually do," I replied. Not dismissive, not sharp, just factual. And for the first time, she didn't have a response ready. The usual lines, the controlled statements, the ability to redirect a situation into something she could manage. None of it seemed to apply here, because this wasn't something she could minimize or reframe. It had already happened publicly, clearly in a way that didn't leave room for interpretation. "Ain't your brother's wedding," she said, like she was trying to anchor the moment back to something she understood. "This is not the place for whatever this is." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it showed exactly how she still saw things, as if this moment had been something I created, something I brought into her event instead of something that existed independently and intersected with it naturally. I didn't interrupt her, didn't correct her immediately. I let her finish, let her hold on to that version of control for just a second longer. And then I responded, still calm, still steady. I didn't plan any of this, and that was the truth. I hadn't orchestrated, the timing hadn't set up. The reveal, I had simply shown up in a life I had built, and that life had, I reached a point where it couldn't stay hidden in spaces like this anymore. And that realization landed differently than anything else I had said, because it removed the one explanation she might have used to protect her perception that this was intentional, that it was some kind of reaction, because if it wasn't planned, then it was real in a way she couldn't control, and for a moment, She just stood there, processing, her expression shifting through something I had never seen directed at me before. Not disappointment, not criticism, but uncertainty about her own understanding. And that was the point where everything truly changed. Not when the music stopped, not when my name was called, but right there, in that quiet space between us, where the version of me she had held on to for 18 years no longer matched anything she could see, and there was nothing left for her to say that would make those two things align again. After that conversation, my mother didn't try to stop me from walking away, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how anymore. The usual control she had over every situation, every narrative wasn't there this time. And as I stepped back into the flow of the reception, it was clear that something had shifted far beyond just that one moment on stage. The energy in the room was different. Not chaotic, not openly dramatic, but altered in a way that couldn't be undone. Conversations had changed direction, not completely, but enough that you could feel it if you paid attention. People who had spent the entire evening reinforcing the same image my mother had carefully built were now adjusting, recalibrating what they thought they understood about our family, and the way they looked at her reflected that shift. Subtle, polite, but unmistakable. Because in spaces like this, perception is everything, and once it changes, it doesn't quietly return to what it was before I moved through the room without trying to engage with it. Not avoiding anyone, but not stepping into those conversations either, because I didn't need to manage the aftermath. It was already happening on its own, and across the room I could see my mother attempting to do exactly that. Moving from group to group, smiling, speaking, trying to re-establish the version of control she had always relied on. But there was a difference now, and a hesitation just beneath the surface, a slight delay in how people responded to her, like they were no longer fully aligned with the image she was presenting, and that was something she couldn't fix with words alone, because the contradiction had already been made visible. My brother stayed near the center of the room, but even his presence felt different, less certain. Like the foundation he had always stood on had shifted slightly, without him fully understanding why. People congratulated him, continued the celebration, but the focus wasn't as singular as it had been before. It had been divided, redirected, and that was something he wasn't used to, not in that space, not in that context. And the moment I caught his was glad. A brief connection that carried more questions than either of us needed to say out loud. Not accusatory, not defensive, just searching, trying to understand how everything he thought he knew about me had changed without him noticing. And I gave him a small nod, not as reassurance, not as explanation, just acknowledgement that the moment had happened, and there was no need to force anything beyond that, because whatever needed to be understood would come later, outside of this space, outside of the expectations that had defined us for so long. The rest of the evening continued, but it didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't, because the narrative had been interrupted in a way that couldn't be smoothed over or ignored. And as the night moved toward its end, as guests began to leave, as the carefully constructed image my mother had worked so hard to maintain started to dissolve into smaller, more private interactions, I understood something clearly. This was the part she had always avoided, the part where she no longer controlled how the story was told, where other people filled in the gaps based on what they had seen, not what she had presented. And that was where the real impact happened. Not in the moment itself, but in everything that followed it. The conversations that would continue after tonight, the questions that would be asked when she wasn't in the room, the quiet reassessment of everything she had said about me over the years. And I didn't need to be part of that. I didn't need to defend anything or reinforce it, because the truth had already been placed exactly where it needed to be, in a space she valued most, in front of people whose opinions mattered to her. And that was enough. I stepped outside for a moment, away from the noise, the lights, the expectations, and the air felt different out there. Quieter, clearer, like everything that had just happened belonged to a space I had already moved beyond. And as I stood there, not replaying the moment, not analyzing, just letting it exist. I realized that this wasn't about winning, it wasn't about proving anything or getting back at anyone. It was about alignment, the point where who I actually was and what the world could see finally matched without needing explanation, and inside the celebration continued in a different form, but I no longer felt connected to it in the way I might have before, because the role I had once been assigned in that space, no longer, he applied, and there was nothing left there for me to reclaim or redefine everything I needed. He had already been built somewhere else. And as I turned to leave, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, just quietly stepping away from a place that no longer defined me, I knew that whatever conversations happened after tonight, whatever conclusions my family or anyone else came to, they wouldn't change anything about the life I had created. They would only confirm what had already been true long before the music stopped. I didn't go back inside after that, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left in that room that required my presence anymore. Everything that needed to happen had already happened, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through something far more permanent: visibility. And as I walked away from the venue, the same one my family had chosen to represent everything they believed success looked like, I realized how different my definition of that word had become, because for years, success to my mother meant control image, the ability to shape how other people saw you. But what I had built didn't depend on any of that. It existed. Whether anyone acknowledged it or not, it grew. Whether anyone approved of it or not, and that was why it couldn't be taken away or redefined the way everything else in that house had been. The next morning, my phone was filled with messages, not just from my family, but from people who had been at the wedding. People who had connected the moment on stage with the conversations that followed, and I read them the same way I had handled everything else, calmly, without attaching more meaning to them than they actually held, because none of those messages changed anything about what I had already built. They just reflected it back in a different way. My mother's message came last, shorter than I expected, not structured, not controlled. Just a few lines that felt unfamiliar coming from her. I didn't know she wrote, and for a second I looked at those words longer than the others. Not because they changed anything, but because of what they represented. Not an apology, not a resolution, just an acknowledgement that something she had been certain about for 18 years was no longer something she could stand on. And I thought about responding, not emotionally, not impulsively, just considering what, if anything, needed to be said. And the answer came quickly: nothing. Because this wasn't a conversation that could be resolved in a single message. And more importantly, it wasn't one I needed to resolve at all. Everything that mattered had already been established, not through words but through actions, through years of building something that didn't depend on her belief in me. And I understood something clearly in that moment. Closure doesn't always come from fixing what was broken. Sometimes it comes from outgrowing it completely, from reaching a point where the past no longer has the ability to shape what comes next. And that's where I was, now, not angry, not looking back, just moving forward with a level of clarity I had never had before. My life continued the way it had been. Structured, intentional, expanding in ways that aligned with what I had already built. New opportunities, new responsibilities, things that required my full attention. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I was invested in what I was creating. And every decision I made reinforced the same thing, that my value had never been tied to the way my mother saw me. It had only ever been limited by how long I believed her version of me was the only one that he existed. And once that belief was gone, everything else followed. Naturally, I didn't hear from her again. After that message, not immediately, not in a way that tried to reopen the past. And I didn't reach out either, because there was nothing unfinished on my side, and nothing I needed to say to feel complete. And that was the final shift. Not the moment on stage, not the conversation at the wedding, but the absence of any need to go back and correct anything, because the truth I've already done that on its own. And as time moved forward, as that night became just another point in a much larger timeline, I didn't think about it as a moment of revenge or even a turning point. I saw it for what it actually was, a confirmation, the point where two completely different versions of my life intersected long enough for one to become visible to the other, and after that they separated again, not in conflict, not in resolution, just in direction. And if there's one thing I've learned, and from all of it, it's this: being called a failure doesn't define who you are. It defines the limits of the person saying it. And the moment you stop trying to fit inside those limits, you create space to become something they were never capable of seeing. And that's not something you need to announce, prove, or defend. It's something that shows up on its own in the right place at the right time, in a way that no one can ignore once it's there. So, if you've been following this story all the way to the end, I want to ask you one question. If someone spent years telling you who you were, would you try to change their mind? Or would you build a life so strong that their opinion becomes irrelevant? Type "prove them wrong" or move on in the comments. And if this story made you see something differently, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next story might be the one that changes everything.